3 chapters, we are introduced to Nick Carraway. He's a young man from Minnesota who has moved to West Egg, Long Island one summer after graduation. Even though Nick has rented a small home, he's surrounded by mansions. One of the biggest is just next door, but it is the home of one of the area's most famous inhabitants, J. Gatsby. More about him later. Unlike other folks, Nick does have connections in East Egg. He went to Yale, and his classmate, Tom Buchanan, who happens to be married to Nick's cousin Daisy Buchanan, lives in East Egg. Tom and Daisy are not alone. They are joined by Jordan Baker, a beautiful but cynical young woman. The group sits around in a state of boredom. They laze around in the summer heat, getting drunk and discussing life in high society. Eventually, Nick and Jordan get into a conversation, and we learn a bit about Tom and Daisy's marriage. Tom is cheating on Daisy. His lover, Myrtle Wilson, is married to George Wilson, a boring garage owner in the Valley of Ashes, an ugly part of New York. This begins Nick's doubts about the life that he thought he would find out in the East. He thought that all the wealth would cause people to have great ideas that would change the world. Instead, it seems that everyone is bored and lying to each other. Back at home, he sees Gatsby on his lawn, gazing across the water at Tom and Daisy's house. In the following weeks, Nick hangs out with Tom more frequently. Tom brings him with him to New York, where they meet up with Myrtle and an obnoxious group in an apartment that Tom rents to keep up with his affairs. Everyone gets pretty drunk, and the party turns vulgar. Myrtle taunts Tom about Daisy, and Tom responds by breaking her nose. Nick eventually gets an invitation to one of Gatsby's parties. This is the first time he gets a look at one of these lavish extravaganzas. No expenses spared, and the emphasis is on partying hard and living it up. Many rumors abound about how Gatsby got his money. A spy? A rum runner? Who knows? Nick and Jordan meet up at the party, and they run into J. Gatsby. This is the first time we get to know the man whom we've heard so much about. He's a surprisingly young man who affects an English accent and calls everyone old sport.
Hello, old sport.
As the party progresses and Nick and Jordan lose track of each other, we find that Gatsby has summoned Jordan into a study for a private conversation. He tells Jordan that he knew her friend Daisy years ago back in Louisville, Kentucky, where they had had a brief affair. He's been in love with Daisy ever since. He spends many nights staring at Daisy's home across the bay from his mansion. His extravagant lifestyle and wild parties are all just attempts to lure and attract Daisy. So far, he's had no luck. Daisy knows nothing of any of this. We've met our main characters. Nick is working his new life, hanging out with Jordan, who shows him around New York, and along with Jordan, he's spending more time with Tom. He spends more time, however, with Gatsby, who wants him to set up an afternoon tea session with Daisy without her knowing that Gatsby will be there to make his accidental entrance. After an initially awkward reunion, Gatsby and Daisy find they still share some of that old magic, and they rekindle their affair. According to Nick, J. Gatsby is really James Gatz from North Dakota, who ended up doing janitorial work to pay for college. He was in the First World War, but is not the action man that many thought he was. Tom ends up at Gatsby's mansion one day by coincidence and finds his wife Daisy there. This causes a scene of much embarrassment, and Daisy wants to head for home. After dinner, Gatsby confides in Nick that what is happening with Daisy is not what he thought it would be. It's not the fantasy that he's had in his head all these years since their innocent times in Louisville, Kentucky. Gatsby stops throwing his parties now that he has a hold of Daisy. Tom has been boiling over and suggests that they all take a trip out to New York together. Nick goes with Jordan and Tom in Gatsby's yellow roadster. In a strange turn of events, Gatsby and Daisy take Nick's car. The trio of Nick, Jordan, and Tom stop at George's garage, where they learn that George knows his wife Myrtle is cheating on him. George doesn't know that Tom is Myrtle's lover, and tells him that he plans to move his family out west to save his marriage. In New York, the group takes a suite at a posh hotel and sits around as the heat intensifies. Tom takes this opportunity to pounce on Gatsby. He calls him out as being a fake, a bootlegger, a criminal. Gatsby keeps his cool. He replies flatly that Daisy loves him, not Tom. It doesn't matter. Tom has called him out and feels like he's won. Tom sends Daisy and Gatsby back home. Daisy can't decide who she loves. Nick, Jordan, and Tom find a horrible scene on their way back to Long Island. At the Wilsons' garage, Myrtle has been struck and killed by a speeding vehicle. George, Myrtle's husband, is beside himself with grief. Someone in the crowd got a glimpse of the hit-and-run vehicle. a yellow roadster. Tom figures he's in luck. Gatsby is doomed. Back at Tom's house, Nick finds Gatsby hiding in the bushes, concerned for Daisy's safety at the hands of Tom. He lets Nick know that Daisy was the one driving the car when it struck Myrtle. This changes everything. Days later, Nick is on pins and needles. Nothing is happening. He finally finds Gatsby and tries to convince him to flee. It is revealed that Daisy was Gatsby's first lover. She was to wait for him after the war. She didn't. Back at the Wilsons' garage, George has gone insane with grief. He must avenge his wife's death, so he consults Tom, who then points him towards Gatsby. George goes to Gatsby's house and finds him relaxing in his pool. George shoots Gatsby dead and then turns the gun on himself. Nick comes home from work where he couldn't stop thinking about Gatsby, only to find the scene of death. This is where the unraveling of Nick's idea of the American dream really takes effect. As Gatsby's only real friend, Nick arranges a funeral. The last chapter is told by Nick, several years after the incident. It seems he needed this time to gain some clarity. For Nick, the dream is over. His relationship with Jordan collapses as he realizes she's as shallow as the rest of them. Tom and Daisy continue as usual, with their money keeping them above the consequences of the real world. Nick decides to move back home. On his last night in West Egg, Nick erases an obscene word that's been written on Gatsby's front steps. He then lies on the beach in the shadow of Gatsby's empty mansion. His dream, and the dream of the new America, is hollow and dead. What a sad and hard lesson to learn. Fitzgerald shows the reader that money doesn't solve anything, really. Throughout The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald shows us that the more you try to fill a meaningless existence with extremes and money, the deeper the hole you end up digging for yourself. The problem is that people have been sold this theory since time began. The truth is, wealth means nothing and can buy nothing of value if the correct set of morals and ethics are not in place. Gatsby has taken a hustle and ridden it all the way to the top. His existence is a lie, and it represents the values that young Americans developed in the Jazz Age. Fitzgerald's marriage to Zelda Fitzgerald is often considered to be the inspiration behind the relationships in many of his novels. Zelda was a major socialite who eventually had to be committed to a sanitarium. Fitzgerald had a stint as a screenwriter in Hollywood during the last half of the 1930s, but he proved to be a difficult employee due to his excessive drinking. The Great Gatsby was not actually a hit when it was first released in 1925, but has grown subsequently into one of the most influential American novels of the 20th century.